Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. My name is Andy Libson, and I'm joined by Kenny Zepeda. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. As you can see, it's just me and Kenny today. Alex is not here. This is his birthday week. I believe he's a Virgo. Do you know what this month is?
So I know it's switch. Yeah, it has to be a no. Yeah, it has to be a Virgo.
Okay, because I think he sent me a little thing about a Virgo. He gave me a little symbol. He sent that to me. So it's his birthday week. So happy birthday to Alex. And Eduardo's going to be here when he's going to be here. So he's going to be like a ghost that haunts a house. He shows up when he wants to show up. But he's not going to be here today. And today we're going to be talking about the economy, and I want to blame Kenny for this. Kenny has been asking for a long time. We got to talk about what's going on with the global economy, national economy. And I'm sure, Kenny, at the time you were hoping we might have more voices to do this. But it is what it is. So let's see where this takes us, because I've, watched some videos, read some stuff, and there's some thoughts running around in my head, but a lot of questions running around in my head as well. So I suspect you're not necessarily thinking that, look, we're not experts. We're not bankers,
No.
or investors.
Yeah.
We are Marxists, and I think both of us believe that the underpinnings of understanding society are to be that really the base of society is understood in terms of its economic relations, labor, capital, productivity, production, and all those things that involve that money. That is the underpinning of society. That is the base, and all the other things are kind of a superstructure built around that. Not that they can't affect those, but ultimately, society is best understood by understanding its economic relations and its economic conditions. So it does make sense that we kind of every once in a while go back and talk about something like this.
Yeah, I mean, at least for me, I just feel like we've put a lot of emphasis on the geopolitical, military, maneuvers and the reasons why, right? Like these states are heading to war, and obviously the economy is also a very strong part of that impetus, and another, I guess, a sphere of war, right? Warfare. Because we've talked in the past about sanctions being an act of war, economic war, and so that's just one element. But there are so many twists and turns. There's so many areas of focus. I don't know exactly where we're gonna head.
Yeah.
Because I mean, we can talk about like the Federal Reserve. We can talk about the gold situation, right? And what does that mean in terms? I mean, they're interconnected, but each section in itself like needs a lot of attention. And by no means, like you said, I feel like I'm an expert, but I also want to make this not just technical, but like what's going on? What are we noticing? Like in terms of the economy, right? Because sorry, that's my kid banging on the door. Yeah, so and I'm gonna bring some of my personal like observations, because I feel like, again, the mainstream media tells you one story, and that's another angle that we can approach, right? Like, why are they doing this again, gaslighting us in some ways, when we know the reality is something different, and that most people feel every day. And when we go to the store, when we are paying for gas, or like just spending for our living, right, trying to make a living.
Yeah, and just to put a pin in it, even though we might not always really highlight this, I think both you and I agree with this statement that I'm about to make, that all the things we've been talking about, from war in the Middle East to war in Ukraine between the United States, NATO, and Russia, to the threats of war in Taiwan, to political dissent and political to COVID, to censorship, to AI development. All of them are the economic situation is not just a feature of all of these things. They underpin. They actually are at the heart of what all these events. So you can't understand them in terms of a Biden policy or a Trump policy or an Obama policy. You can't even understand it in terms of a deep state. Like, well, can you understand the deep state better? At least I think from my understanding is that what's driving these things and the reason that many of these things for us seem inevitable is these things are driven by the search for profits, for resources, for markets and market share, and the competition between various capitals. And I think both you and I would describe Russia as a capital, Europe and Germany as a capital, Brazil as a capital, United States, of course, China as a capital, and there are many minor capitals that align with other capitals, but there is a sea of sometimes cooperating, sometimes always competing capitals, that are that under which our society it rests. Like we're set within that a society where capital and capital ownership by a minority versus the rest of us who are wage earners and are exploited. That means we are robbed of the value of our work every day, in the form of surplus value that people often call profits. That this is the fundamental thing that drives everything we're watching. And this is why when you hear us say, we can't solve this unless we get rid of this system, this is what we're talking about. So just like people talk about, like intersectionality might say there's racial oppression and class oppression and da da da. No, as Marxists, there's a fundamental way that things operate that you need to do that you need to understand in order to understand what's happening, and that is mostly, well, that is the economy and the economic system, really, not just the economy, the economic system. So we're going to spend a little time talking about some of those features today, but I think that's worth just spelling out.
And I think I would add that this is where we might like deviate, right, with some people that might argue like the global elite or the globalists, right, like the
Yeah.
new world order, because I do think there's a tendency for the new new world order type of worldview to still adhere into capitalism, and that there is also like the liberal left by and large talking about essentially reforming or doing regulations, one or the other, right, depending on the camp that you're coming, but not undoing the entire system of profit seeking, right, as a means to deliver what is needed for society to run, right. And there's also of the more classical, I guess, conservative or views that when we are saying to get rid of the system, we're saying for state run, so a state run society. But you and I, we're not saying that.
Right.
Like, because that's also most Marxists really, I would say, that tend to agree with that notion that a state run society is the only alternative. Yeah. Right. And we disagree with that. Right. We haven't really taken a deep dive into like why we say that like the Soviet Union was a state-run capitalist, right? In that thing, that's for another episode. But again, just to clarify, we're not saying that the alternative is to have a state that tells us what to do, right? Because this is the same thing essentially, what we're living in, and it's actually becoming more evident of this centralization of power, right? In dictating how society runs, and so I just wanted to make that distinction that we're not advocating for, again, a strong state, right? We're the opposite.
Yep. Yep.
And, yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, one more thing. Sorry.
Yeah.
And then again, this notion, right? And this is a critique that I have of more libertarian views that if the state is done away and they let capitalism run itself by itself, with less regulation, less hands involved, just in its natural cost way, I guess.
Yeah.
That it would run more efficiently, more fair, more free, right?
Yep.
But that is a huge disagreement. That's not the tendency of the capitalist system. We are here because of the capitalist system, not because there are some rogue actors or there are some like individuals with a lot of power that corrupt the system, right? What we are arguing, I would say, is no. This is where capitalism has led,
Yeah.
because of its forces, its internal forces, in the drive for profit and the tendency to monopolize power in markets and all that stuff. And so that's what we are. What we are.
Yeah. And this is something where Jeff is often, we have talked often on this show, particularly you and I, that we believe World War III is inevitable, nuclear war is inevitable if capitalism continues because of the competitive nature of capitalism. And Jeff has countered, he doesn't disagree with that, but he says, look, there's a centralizing aspect to capitalism as well. That is definitely the case. And the centralizing aspect means that even if you had these smaller spheres, they will eventually compete and then collude together to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then they're going to cheat. And people are going to say, well, that's not capitalism. But that's what capitalism produces. Capitalism produces bigger gorillas that then, basically, kind of knock aside all the other smaller monkeys. And that's just the way it is. So you can't, the people who say that this isn't really capitalism, I don't think they understand how capitalism works. So, so where do you want to start today? Because there's a million different directions to go.
I mean, yeah, exactly. I can throw out some options. I mean, I think that one of so we can analyze like data, right? Like maybe just for starters, like just to say where we're at. Like I sent some stuff. We can just talk about it. I don't know if you want to show it but like statistics from like the Federal Reserve.
I don't have those to show right now. So do you have them?
Let me pull up that real quick. All right. So I guess this is where I wanted to show. You can only see the screen, like the.
No, I can see. I can see. It doesn't matter. I can be able to condense it down because I can see. I can see your. Yeah, it's good. It's good.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. So yeah, this is one of the graphs I sent. I guess that it talks about like the credit card delinquency. Uh, Sorry. Yeah, credit card loans delinquency, and so it shows over here, from 2022 and more recently, just steadily going up. And to me, like that's a sign of people being in trouble and subsidizing their living uh, based on credit and instead of the income that they have. Where is the other one? There is the other one. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or because the other thing I wanted to point out that this is the last time this spiked. This was nearing 2008.
Yeah.
Right. That it just went up, right, because the economy just fell off.
Yeah.
Its wheels, and so to me, it's an indicator of where we're at, and generally by the time because it takes a couple quarters, right, for the for it to be declared officially a recession. And
Yeah.
so far we've been told that there is no recession. Today, actually, there was the labor statistics were released regarding job creation, right?
Yeah.
And the numbers were lower than they expected, but they are shown to be increasing. But if you've been paying attention, there's been a number of revisions to that statistic over the past few months, and last month actually, they revised the 12-month period down by 818,000 jobs.
Mm.
less produced. So we were told that there were more jobs produced over the last 12 months than they actually were. And
Yeah.
apparently, this has been a thing that's been ongoing, where the job created, the jobs numbers of jobs created were revised down consistently. But this number apparently is a very big discrepancy and like unprecedented, like to be revised down by that much. Like it's almost a million jobs that were not created that they told us, and so, but obviously, giving good news, giving less bad news, it's a way of maintaining chaos aside, maintaining chaos in the markets, and affecting potentially the financial markets in credit and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say something.
Well, you talked about two things there. You talked about this and then this other thing with about what was the last thing you mentioned? Sorry.
The
Um,
labor statistics.
yes, labor statistics and the recent Fed likelihood if it's going to cut interest rates. So first off, looking at this thing, I mean, I guess I'll say like, I mean, I know that there was a crisis in 2000, and you don't necessarily see an increase in loans there. Although the percent, I don't know what that percentage means. A percentage in relationship to what? Maybe it's credit card loans in relationship to all commercial banks. Is that a percentage? I don't know, but the and then you can see yes, there's a rise in that percentage in 2008, but that percentage is about twice what it already is right now. And then the last major economic crisis was 2020, which doesn't show any sort of change in the credit card loan situation in relationship to that. So this particular graph doesn't do too much for me, to be honest. It other than it the feature that is often talked about that people worry about and talk about is debt. You know, overall debt, uh, corporate debt, private citizen debt, and U.S. debt. You know that is a something that I know that people talk about as being worrisome, like the idea that the U.S. has $35 trillion worth of debt and pays its total interest on its debt payments are equal to the total budget of the U.S. government, and maybe even larger than it or something like that. So um, that's what I would say in terms of that graph doesn't like it doesn't make me happy, doesn't make me sad. I just go, okay, there it goes.
I guess what I guess my point is, so I understand because there is a big focus on the federal, reserve. There's a big focus on the national debt, right, which is about $30 trillion.
Yeah.
So it's more than we actually produce in a given year in economic production, economic production. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, those are separate things. The reason I bring this up is because. Yes, we talk about that, and yes, that's an issue, and yes, has an effect on inflation, right? Because this whole debt and borrowing and money creation, especially that happened after 2020, has had a huge impact on the cost of things because and therefore the lives of people on Main Street, right? Not Wall Street, right? Because generally, when we're talking about this debt, I feel like that's more talking about the stock market and a little less talking about the real troubles of real people. Because in the reason I wanted to bring attention to these, right? One, because the other graphs that I couldn't find is that delinquency on car loans, right? That is a bubble that is being inflating for a while, and especially since 2020, because a lot of people, including me and a lot of friends I know, bought cars in that period of the pandemic because we weren't allowed to go places. Transportation was hard to, public transportation became an issue. And the reason I want to focus more on the Main Street aspect is because I keep reading stories of, the Wall Street Journal, on the New York Times, on Time Magazine, headlines where they're telling us that the problems with the economy are just about attitude, that they're about us freaking out, that they're not real, right? Because they talk about inflation coming down, right? Like the federal, Jerome Powell, he talked some weeks ago, talked about where we at and what they're going to do about interest rates. And so he talked about inflation being at 2 point something, being about pre-pandemic levels, but they omit the fact that inflation is a compounding thing. So the real inflation percentage is about 30 to 40% on the cost of things. It's not 2.5%. That doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the point I wanted to make, with, households, because I've heard that about 25 to 30% of households are having difficulty paying the bills month to month.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, Jeff sent us that thing that Michael Pento, who's a bourgeois capitalist, who is one of those people who's a free market capitalist who believes that if we just he sees lots of problems in the economy, but says, okay, if we just let the economy rip, just let the market be free, there'll be an immense amount of pain, but then out of that pain will come a brighter day, right? And he's also, he kind of wonders, like, maybe they've actually gone beyond the point of return, where maybe the pain now is too much. Like, he kind of suggests that at the end. But one of the things he says that it was interesting to me was that when he talked about debt, and I thought it was him saying it, although I've seen a number of things to get ready for this, is he kind of somebody pointed out that debt, what does debt mean? Debt means that there are creditors who are collecting money. Debt doesn't just exist that all of us are in debt. It means that the vast majority, like a bunch of people, are in debt, but then there are creditors. So when we talk about growing debt, what we're really talking about is the growing inequality that is taking place in society, because creditors are not worried about debt. Debt is something that people who owe money worry about. The people who lent the money and you owe it to them, they're like, cool. I mean, unless you basically default, right? And so when listening to that, and I don't know if it was him, but it was somebody, because I agree with you. There's a way that people just talk about these giant numbers, and they seem to be like, well, that must be somebody else. And it's like, no, what these numbers you're hearing about are an expression of saying that the rich are getting rich, are accelerating towards wealth, and the poor are accelerating towards poverty, deeper poverty. And that's what these numbers mean, because they are an expression of the fact that wealth is being accumulated into smaller and smaller hands, and everyone else is having to borrow from them in order to survive. So that was one thing. The second thing that maybe it was somebody else who pointed this out, that is that inflation is a consumer or a wage killer. Inflation attacks wages. It doesn't attack capital. It doesn't attack assets. Like, gold doesn't care about inflation, but your income does. So inflation is an attack on the working class. And one of the things Michael Pento did say, I know he said this, is that the notion that we've had 9% inflation during this worst time, he said that's a complete lie. Everyone knows, and that's true. When I see buying eggs, when I see buying milk, when I go to the store, we're talking about a 30 to 40% price increase on most things, on like cereal and things like that. And he mentions the same thing in housing. And so these numbers that we're hearing, 9% going to 3%. Well, it was never 9%. It's probably not 3%. And he even said, well, what are you talking about in celebrating the 9 to 3%? That all that means is, like, you are still seeing a 3% increase in inflation, and all you're doing is you're lowering the amount of pain and suffering you're causing people. So those are some things that come to mind for me as I listen to you talk.
And again, in a good, healthy economy, about 2% is considered like normal, a 2% rate of inflation. And so that's kind of like the target for the Federal Reserve with their, quantitative easing and monetary policy. They're trying to keep it on target to that. But again, it still means that everyone else is. We're always paying more while our real wages, right, like when our wages are adjusted for inflation, haven't really increased, over the last 30 to 40 years. And so, and also the point that we're talking about here, we're talking about the period from 2020 to now. We're
Yeah.
not talking about the last 20 years. We're talking about the last 4 years, and really the last 3 years, because it took a second for things to really, start screwing, the prices and all that. Like, I think after 2021 until now is where we got hit hard. In Again, one of the critiques, right, it's that the government printed a lot of money, right? That the in Like, I want to bring attention back to Fabio Vighi, because when we were in the thick of the quote unquote pandemic, he was one of those few where really one of the only voices that were contextualizing the economic turmoil happening in 2019, on the repo markets.
Yeah.
In that in that context, he argues that 2020 made sense. That the reason the pandemic was called that the world economy was brought to a halt, an abrupt, unprecedented halt, was because they needed to cool down the economy in fast. In BlackRock, right? BlackRock was the one who also produced a paper on that prior to this.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, Fabio Vighi, people can find him on the Philosophical Saloon. There has a number of articles, and you can look back where he makes that argument. And I bring that up because, again, we got given money. A lot of money was printed, but most of that money, the trillions of dollars that they pumped into the economy, which, by the way, they had already started pumping money before the pandemic was called. And they were already dumping a lot of money into these repo markets. And again, Fabio makes a good argument about this. During the pandemic, they gave us a lot of money. But let's remember, this is why I say that the pandemic was not a small thing. It was a massive thing, world changing. So they made all this money out of thin air, right? And so we knew, anyone who knows like basic economics, capitalist economics, knows that if you infuse a lot of money without really creating any value or actual things and services, the asset value of things are gonna be lifted. And out of that bailout, right, like all that money, which dwarfs the 2008 bailout by magnitudes, most of that money didn't go to Main Street. Most of us. Right. Most of that money went to bail out corporations. And since that period, since 2020, we talk about the rich getting richer, right? They have gotten rich in an unprecedented fucking way in the last 3 to 4 years. Mm-hmm. Like, where they doubled their wealth. Before the 2020, we were talking about someone, the richest billionaire, whatever, having like $100 billion or 90 something. And now, like, they're worth like $200 billion. And this is something that hasn't cost any sweat on them. Really, they haven't paid a cost at all. Of this massive transfer of wealth upwards in finance through this system of infusing money into the economy.
Well, partly that's because people have thought about the COVID period as a period where all of us were getting money, and that's not true. Even in the context of some kind of tax break you might have got or money back from the government, many people, and you can see it with Blacks and Latinos, and particularly in terms of business, small business like that, took massive hit, right? And saw a loss in their total net value of their households or net value of their situation. Unfortunately, that notion that everyone was getting a piece of the action, even if it was unequally distributed. No, it wasn't actually true. Some people whose situation was declining, and others were massively going up. And like you said, and that was banks, and that was investors, and that was like all the major businesses, the businesses that were allowed to stay open during the time when other peoples were forced to be shut. Like the government was literally saying, you get to do business, and only you get to do business, so you can only go to them. And so that's one thing, is that people hidden within that, even though it's not that hidden, like, is this notion that everyone got something, during that time. Maybe it wasn't unfair. It was unfair, but it was everyone's getting something. It's no, they were the growth of inequality was accelerated during that time, and like you said, it has continued apace during this course of the inflate as a result of the inflation that has come of it. And inflation is an attack on working class because it affects wages way more than it affects capital. And Another way that you can say they've gotten away with this is this issue we keep coming up with when we keep talking about, when we say that this whole blaming immigrants and saying they're taking your jobs. Your jobs, the value of your job is being stolen from you every day by this inflation, and that you're not talking about. And I'll put aside AI. I'll put aside, your job being taken by a robot. The value of your job is being stripped right in front of you. Like, with inflation, that's a result of the massive funds they put into the economy, that they printed money so that the rich could essentially get richer. And so this, it shows how far back we are, that people are even bringing up this question of immigration right now, and thinking that immigrants are somehow a part of the problem of our financial future. You and I know they're part of the solution if revolutionists ever happen, but they do not feature in many meaningful way into the actual assault that workers are actually taking. They don't feature. Like, the assault, they themselves are a result of an assault. And just like anybody, we move around in order to get out from under it. Just like people move from California to Texas, and from California to Florida. So I don't know. I'll just leave it at that for now.
No, I think it's important to address that because I hear that a lot, and again, people that consider themselves more on the slight right wing, or the leftists who criticize this, the COVID lies and all that stuff. But now they're on board with this narrative that I think is very well rooted everywhere. That there's always a blame placed on this mass influx of immigrants, onto the economy, and as if they are coming here to take your factory jobs, as if they're coming here to take your office job, as if they're the ones making things more, as if they're the ones buying houses immediately. It just like it takes many years, as an immigrant myself, it takes many years to get your footing unless you have like a good chain of immigration. And the other thing that gets like put on them, on the undocumented immigrants, is that they're giving money, right? Like, and the ones who the actual U.S. citizens are not giving anything, right? But if they are getting anything, it's crumbs compared to, again, all the money that was printed, all the money that's being transferred upwards with this asset inflation, right? Which makes the richer richer.
Yeah.
And so it's a safety valve for the people who rule this world, not only to use them as cheap labor when they can on like menial jobs, because again, none of them are gonna come. I work in a poultry factory, I guess. I don't know if it's called it, but and we're like, they don't hire undocumented immigrants, but they do. The jobs that they get hired to are outsourced. I've explained this before, but so the people who clean the factory, they are undocumented, but they are a separate company from the actual, this happens in any poultry company, in any like food producing company, where, in order for the company to not have liability, they hire this, contractors to come in and do the dirtiest, the hardest jobs. And my point is that, in like a year ago, when things were actually the job situation, we had a lot of openings and we didn't have enough people to take these jobs, which compared to other jobs is decently paid, but not many people wanted to come and do these jobs. And again, so when the economy was good, it was running well. So the immigrants didn't come and make the economy worse. The economy has reached its place because of what we discussed, right? It's capitalism. It has periodic crises. This crisis has been in the works since 2008. Since all that money that was influx into the economy. But again, just to bring it back to immigrants, it's not. It's such an easy cop out. It's I think a lack of understanding of the forces at play that are making this economic reality for everyone difficult.
Yeah, and the 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 crises, the economic crises, there was one in 2008, but the U.S. the global economy is it periodically racked with crises. Again, this guy Pento called it the business cycle. He said there's no way to get around the business cycle, which is the things will rise and then eventually things will fall, and then you try to out of the fall you try to rise again. Um, but one of the things you'll see, and he kind of went back to the 1980s when he talked about 80s and then the 90s and then 2000, then 2008, then 2020, and what he sees as a coming new crisis as a result of multiple bubbles. One feature, one feature I hear in all the various economists who are talking about their worries is each of them says, "Oh shit, the one coming seems to be worse than the last one we had, and the one we just had seems to be worse than the one like the COVID one was worse than the one we had in 2008, and 2008 is worse than the one we had in 2000." And so the fact that these crises get ever and ever worse, they never really explain why that is. They often put it in terms of policies. Um, Marxism wouldn't say that. Marxism would say, no, there's a falling rate of profit that is underneath all these sorts of things that are going to make each boom less of a boom, and then each crisis more of a pit. And that tendency for the falling rate of profit, and that tendency that's a result of the fact that, or a major part of that tendency, because there's many things that cause the rate of profit to fall, but the major one, which is the need to increase productivity by investing more in machinery than in actual living labor so that you can build things efficiently and cheaply, that actually has the effect of limiting the actual place from which profit comes from, which is from the work done by living labor. And if you make living labor a smaller and smaller piece of your entire investment portfolio, then you are making the possibility of profit a smaller and smaller piece of whatever a business will do. Now, on top of that, I mean, this is also what some of these folks are going to talk about, is that much of the money that is being made today is completely separate from the productive center of like industry and production and machinery and things like that. Much of this is just financial tricks that are done with the market in order to peel off the money that's in there that the government keeps pushing more and more into. I mean, that was the stimulus that, like the 2020 stimulus that was put in there. BlackRock said, like, if we don't do some of this, if we don't have a massive stimulus, we're going to see a collapse, not unlike or worse than what we saw in 2008. And they wanted to fend that off. That's why Vigi calls the COVID period a controlled demolition of the economy, collapsing apart and then massive infusion to build up the sectors that needed to be maintained and not allowed to fall. So that's something that all of these bourgeois economists who don't believe in Marxism, yet they keep on describing a system that works a lot like Marx described.
I mean, like even so, again, the Federal Reserve is in all these economies' mouths. Every time they talk, they bring up the Federal Reserve, and they were literally created to after like the 1907 like crisis.
Yeah.
And so because there was this acknowledgement by the capitalists, the JP Morgans and the other big banks, there was this acknowledgement that these panics, they called them back then, were part of the system. There was a bunch of them in the 1800s.
Mhm.
And so by early 1900, they were like, hey, we need to do something, because the one that was happening in 1907 was pretty bad. And they didn't, and because money wasn't digital, they literally had to move shit around, like bills. It would take a long time to have an effect. And so they decided to come up with these like private public thing, right? Like, because when you dive into the Fed, right, it's technically a private
Yeah.
institution serving a public function. And so they're regulated. There's basically bankers regulating themselves, understanding that the system has issues. The capitalism has these massive issues of liquidity and capital, issues, and that they have to mitigate. And that is the mission of the Fed, right? To try to navigate these turbulent waters. Um, in its solution, they create other problems, which is something that Marx, right, like, talks about, that the seeds of the next crisis are being planted right now, essentially. And that's what we've seen since 2008, or earlier too, 2000, and even that before that. So again, yes, like they acknowledge that there are these crises, but there's also people who are advocating for a complete you know, uh, liberalization of the economy, right? Like, no, don't put your hands in it. The Fed is a problem. Like, if you left it alone, like, I guess we wouldn't have those panics that they were trying to solve in 1907.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, and let me think what I want to say about that. Well, first, the other thing that I remember from that time, and this was Teddy Roosevelt, right, who was basically trying to break up a lot of these monopolies in the and that wasn't that 1910, 1912, and that did not solve the problem, because they still needed a world war to then. We still got to the position of a world war, and so there are some people who look at these world wars as essentially profit-taking moments, as like, yes, there were wars and yes, they were violent, but really behind the scenes are Rockefellers and these actors who are like, we want to make this war happen so we can make a killing. I don't see that. I mean, yes, there are people who always, like right now in Ukraine, who are thinking they're going to try to make a killing. That's always the case, but that's not what's driving the war. What's driving these wars is the need, the fall in the rate of profit, and the need to expand yourself in order to make it possible to grab new resources, to grab new markets in the context of a shrinking, your own shrinking situation. And at the same time, the massive overproduction that has taken place, because the 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 problem of, no, you can't produce anything because you've already produced a ton of stuff, and there's no one who's going to pay for anything that where you make more of something that's already overly produced. And one of the features that people talk about, what solved the economic crisis from World War II, was not FDR's New Deal, which didn't make a dent in the economic situation. It was the massive destruction of capital across the globe that laid the basis for the return of profitability. And so, in many ways, when Michael Pento says we're going to need to experience extreme pain under capitalism in order to make it possible for capitalism to reemerge, that's what we're really looking at World War III. Like, that's the level of extreme pain that's going to need to be experienced. That could. I sent an article out where the United States is basically. It was an article talking about the changed nuclear posture of the United States, and I think I think I sent it to you as well. That basically, where the United States is saying, we think we can win a nuclear war with regards to U.S. and China, but there's a new technology that we have developed that will mean that if we do a preemptive strike of Russia and China and do it properly, we'll eliminate so large a percentage of their nuclear capacity that, yeah, we'll take a hit, they'll be destroyed, and we'll suffer. We'll feel the pain, but they will be destroyed. And that is not just a nuclear path to victory, but is a preemptive strike path to victory, where the U.S. must strike first in order to destroy the nuclear capacity of its opponents. And that level of destruction is what is possibly required to make it possible for the economy, the engine of capitalism, to revive itself. And that is what we're looking at. So in that regard, me and Michael Pinto are looking at the same situation in which pain is required in order to survive. I don't think he realizes that if you let capitalism loose, then the nukes must go loose as well in order to see whether or not there is a place for production to occur, or the place for capitalist productivity or capitalist profits to be refound.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in that sense that, again, yet there is another angle as to why they have to push for war, why they can lose the game, and why in destruction there is a potential for a return to profitability and domination of the markets, right? Because also Jeff sent us something else that I watched a while back, and I don't remember the title, but it was about the distinction, right, of these Russia and China
Oh, yeah.
resource-based economies and these financialized capitalist economies of the West, right, like Europe and the U.S.
Yeah.
And that you said that a second ago that more and more the money that is created in the West is decoupled from real things like goods and services, right? Like that's how the capitalist economists put it. And in order for the system to work in some sort of balance, there has to be a coupling of those things, like the money created to creating things, right? And but again, the stock market has nothing to do with the shit that we produce, right? And so in banks themselves, they're in the business. That's something I was hearing a lot in my research, or that banks, they're the money creators, like, so the Federal Reserve facilitates loans, but when you have the fractional reserve lending, or do you remember that term, where basically the bank has to keep a percentage of your
Oh, yeah.
money,
Right.
and then they can loan out the rest. So if you put in $100, they have to keep $10 and loan out 90. But what they do is they keep your 100 and they borrow some from the Federal Reserve, and they loan out 900.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so they're creating money, and so they're in the business of creating money. They're not in the business of creating goods and services necessarily. So the point being is that there is this decoupling that didn't just happen yesterday. And it became more obscene with the COVID period, which, as I view it, it was an attempt to stave off a massive financial catastrophe that would have involved the whole world, even China and Russia. So they also had an incentive to kind of put a stop on this bleeding. And actually, what we've seen that, at least I've heard, that China has been dumping a lot of the debt in U.S. Bonds and treasuries and stuff. And I sent you a video about that there has been more emphasis on moving on to gold
Correct.
as a reserve currency by states, not just individuals, because a lot of people who are into the investment, and they talk about it. There's a lot of people telling you put your money into gold because the dollar is no longer secure. The dollar is an issue. There is also BRICS, right? They're trying to make their own economic arrangements, and a lot of the members of BRICS are the ones like putting their money reserves in gold and no longer in American dollars.
Right.
Right.
They're dual holding, right? But they are definitely taking more of the val. They're removing more of their wealth in the form of U.S. dollars and replacing it with gold and replacing it with the other currency that they talk about in BRICS, with the REMBIT or something like that. I can't remember. Do you remember what its name was?
I don't remember.
Yeah, but it's the other currency that they're trying to build as a possible alternative to the U.S. currency that could underscore whatever is being sold between those countries. So it could be done not in terms of dollars, but in terms of this new currency that Russia and Iran and Brazil and China are posing as an alternative to the U.S. currency. Oh, there was something I was going to say about that. Damn.
There are also discussions about trade and exchange in terms of bundles of goods, and not money or dollars, but
Yeah.
just goods and services, I guess,
Right.
exchanged. Uh,
But one thing I want to say about when I think about what we talk about the relative success of the success stories of China and Russia, um, they are also are dealing with they are also dealing with the problem of debt balloons in their country. Um, I do think the advantage that they hold in relationship to the United States is the fact that the state is a heavier actor in controlling the economy and in controlling the decisions that are made. And that is the reason why Russia is being more successful militarily, why the reason that China is being more successful militarily some way, but economically across the globe. And I think why its economy can seem more stable because of the fact that and the state and the corporations are more tightly fused, and in fact, they're blended together. And that's where you talk about Putin kind of controlling the oligarchs as opposed to the oligarchs controlling Putin. And I do think that is where the United States is going to head. Yet the United States is going to need to head in a direction where the state is more heavily intervening and more heavily controlling every operation that the United States does. And that will be no less capitalism than what you talked about earlier, like state-run capitalism as opposed to free market capitalism. None of those things are a solution to the problems of capitalism. Although I do believe, particularly in times of war, state capitalism is the way that capitalists organize themselves in order to fight those wars. And so China, and you can think of China and Russia, are on war footing uh, on an earlier stage than the United States, and the United States is way well behind. And the United States is going to have to do a sell job. Part of that sell job was done with bringing down the twin towers in 9/11, and there will be future false flags. There was a false flag of COVID that was also trying to seal the state and public-private partnerships, and there are going to be future false flags that will also be used to justify a war footing in which the state is going to be the sole act, ultimately the sole arbiter of where the economy is directed, and it's going to be doing that on the basis of preparing and fighting wars.
yeah, no, I agree with you that I mean it's been evidence that the West is way behind in terms of its war readiness, because of this free market approach to war making, right? And the relatively unchallenged, last 30 years. Uh, and so yes, I agree that we're heading towards that. This is why this technocratic shit makes sense, right? Because China and Russia, they have their own shit, of controlling their own populations, and more efficiently guiding people, right? Because this is one of the critiques of the Soviet Union, right? Like the state, decided what people did and how, right? In some ways, it was very efficient, and they achieved massively, you know, advancements in such a short period, right? And rightly so, like the critique, of people who are, critical of the Soviets, that yes, like fuck that shit,
Right.
and but yet again, here you just pointed out, we're heading because this system has to do that, because it has to catch up very soon, or but obviously they have the nuclear options, but in order to maintain power, they still have to catch up, for whatever remains of the world. In and it's just scary, right? Because I don't think there is option B.
Yeah.
The rest of the world, like BRICS, I do think they represent, an attempt to challenge, the West. But I just like you think that it only gets resolved through brutality, destruction, uh, because it's not going to be done in this civil like commerce, agreements. There's a reason China has a big fucking naval force. There's a reason the U.S. is still interested in Taiwan. That's what they're going ham in Ukraine, and they can't back down. They have to escalate.
Yeah. One other thing, and this one I might want to share my screen on, because it was an article I had seen. It was on my phone, and then so it was an article today. Goldman Sachs issues huge Fed crash warning as legendary trader suddenly flips his Bitcoin price prediction. So first of all, and now maybe I'll stop. I don't know if I have to continue to share this. I don't think I need to. So what are some of the things that are said in that article? First off, a Bitcoin guy basically said, I think you can be bullish on Bitcoins in September. And then he's trading his mind, because what's happened as a result of this Goldman Sachs statement that basically is saying we're heading towards a kind of a nuclear, well, they didn't say nuclear, a currency crisis, a currency collapse. We have a pretty quickly, we're coming to a US dollar currency collapse. And because of that, we need the Fed to lower the interest rates, and because then they're going to have to do that as a result of like the jobs thing you were mentioning that's going to come out, which doesn't look that good. And when this was said, Bitcoin lost like $2 trillion total, like not just Bitcoin, but all the various cryptocurrencies, the total 2 trillion, which is the same amount that I guess there was the stock market loss in August, back in, was it August 8th, when there was a major fall in the market as well.
So Japan, right?
Yeah. And so I hear this, and of course I hear Goldman Sachs saying this kind of thing, and I go, oh, I don't know what to make of those sorts of things. Yes, I do know that the US currency is now under all sorts of attacks. And it's partly as a result of what the US itself have done to sanction off all these various countries, to say we're going to try to use our currency as a weapon against you. And so countries are trying to insulate themselves from the currency. And of course, the massive printing of dollars that we just mentioned can have that effect on the value of the currency. Now, 58% of the currency used across the globe is still the US dollar. So people say, well, that's not likely to happen. But I was telling Brandy, like when I listen to titles like that, I wonder if that's fear that if they're afraid of something, or if they are trying to make us afraid of something. Like that's when I struggle with things like that again, and it's even harder for me to assess economically, because I'm not a bourgeois economist. I don't actually know how their system really works. But one thing I can say is everything I've heard does tell me that the U.S. currency is getting weaker as a result of its ability to control itself across the globe. But I also believe that a collapsing U.S. currency is very well going to be the basis by which, because what a collapsing U.S. currency will mean that it will make inflation right now look like a drop, because it's really going to mean that the value of the dollar has completely bottomed out, and that means the value of our dollars. That means wages themselves are going to become really low value, and whatever savings you have that isn't in gold, that isn't in silver, that isn't in assets, and again, that's where capitalists come into hand. Your pension funds and things like that, which aren't necessarily connected to gold and silver, all those things go down in value, and you are really sunk. And I could very easily see that be the moment in which we are handed the lifeline of a digital currency, a new fiat currency that, at least temporarily, seems to have some hope, some value to it in relationship to the dollars that have now become completely plunged. So even something like that, where I wonder if there's a real competition happening between China and Russia, like in BRICS versus the West, on which currency will win. I can also see how our capitalists are going to use a currency devaluation to push us into a digital currency, which will mean that they have a much greater chance of controlling us with that currency than they have currently now. And that's something that they will need if they're going to continue to create more and more separation between the wealthiest and the poorest, and between the working class and the capitalist class. So those are the sorts of things that I start to like get confused about, because I do take Goldman Sachs' statement very seriously. And there is some fear stuff in there, like, oh, look, Bitcoin's just gone down in value. But if you read into the article, all they're really saying is, well, on the short term, Bitcoin looks like cryptocurrency looks like it's lowering its value, but in the long term, I can see it raising its value. So it's like, wait, that's not that worrisome. That's just an investor. That's like only talking to some kind of investor about what should you put your money into right now. So this is where I struggle with this discussion of the economy and a discussion of making sense of all the fear that's out there. Because once again, I struggle with the fact that I'm a little bit helpless in relationship to people who know more about this, and to know when is there something that I should be afraid of, and when am I being made afraid of something in order to be controlled.
And so I guess this is where I focus on, again, what I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing, to tell me that there is something that's going to affect the working people. And so you're right, like, to question these narratives, right? Because it's hard to know what's trying to achieve what, and these so-called experts are not immune to this. We are not immune to falling into some narrative that falls right into the hands of the powerful. But what I know is that I can afford a fucking home. You can afford a fucking home, right? Asset, again, that's an asset, right? That's a store of at least, if the house prices keep going, store of value, whatever. But it's still a fundamental thing, being able to have a house that no one can kick you out of, right? Like, that you can afford, that hopefully the bank doesn't repossess. And so I know that that's one thing. I know that prices are fucking insane. We go to the store, and what we used to buy 3 years ago, it's insane. It's insane. We go out, it's harder to fucking go out for most people, for a lot of people. There is a good chunk of people that they're okay with, they make enough, they're closer to the levers of power. The other
what the person on that one talked about, he said basically about the top 20% is okay. There's a 1% that's just ripping, getting massively wealthy, but the first quintile, the first 20% is like, yeah, that's not bad during this time.
Yeah. And so I remember I was telling you about my job. So a year ago, we needed people. We didn't have enough people. Now I see sections of the factory fucking shutting down. They're redistributing workers, trying to keep them employed. There is contracts that are being challenged, because the economy is having issues. If you believe Disney is reporting that they're not getting as many customers. But again, what I see is that, now the factory that I work at, we were working 6 days sometimes, normally, like, because we were fucking, producing a lot of things, and they were demanding 10, 12-hour days from us. This week, they just announced, or at least I know through the people that are in the supervising roles, that they're cutting down to 4 days of killing chickens.
Yeah.
And so, we were doing 6 days, and like, we didn't have enough people, and so they're shrinking back. Contracts are being pulled, they're being challenged. And so this tells me, and I know that other companies, factories are cutting down, like John Deere is one of them, and many others are firing people. And so, and again, like, inflation, like, we haven't had a period of deflation, really, anyone who's living has never seen that. Like, maybe like a tiny period where, like, there was a small reduction, but nothing. Everything just keeps getting increased. So the people who can access these assets, right, are only a selected group of people. And again, like, I- and then we have a system of private property, right, that protects them. We have a state that protects their assets, and so I know there is a crisis coming because I don't know how much more expensive things can get. Salaries are just not going up, in it's just getting harder for people to have kids. Like I don't know what I would do if like we didn't have our family's help.
Hmm.
But so again, these are real shit, like what I'm seeing, experiencing here, uh beyond these big numbers, in and also the wars that are happening and all this stuff. So there is crisis already. We're not heading into a crisis. We are in crisis. We've been in crisis. There may be a more exaggeration of these issues that throws more people into deeper holes, but the crisis is here, and it's only getting worse. Uh, and so, again, going back to this notion of pain, right? Like something is going to have to happen. My brother keeps telling me that. My brother doesn't pay attention to all these conversations. He doesn't listen to us. We talked about real shit and how things get expensive, but he keeps telling me something is going to have to happen.
Hmm.
And that is the question, like who, in whose terms is that going to happen? Because there is no way out of this without pain. And that's the reality. It's just a matter of like who's gonna destroy what. In my view.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about it in terms of civil war, um, and the terms of their civil war, when they talk about it, are blue states and red states. They talk about California and New York versus Texas in the center of the country. Um, to me, that's not a civil war. To me, that is basically workers workers who are being controlled by capitalists being pitted against each other so that the capitalists can get over on both sides. Um, an actual civil war, which is something we do need, is one where the working class unites and fights against the capitalist class. Um, that kind of civil war is one that we should welcome and be like, yeah, there'll be battles, there'll be violence, um, but that's a liberatory act for a group of people who are being oppressed and exploited, and ending what is effectively their enslaved-like conditions that they're living under that are getting worse. Um, so we're going to be told that civil war is bad, and the kind of civil war that's being put on offer, which is Democrats versus Republicans, that's not civil war. That's a fucking joke. That's like I said, that's like tastes great versus less filling. It can be violent. Maybe you can get those people to go against each other, but no part of that will have any way to actually change the situation we are living under. In fact, it's going to be a show for the capitalists to, in the same way that they pit us against immigrants, they're going to be able to pit native worker versus native worker in a red state, blue state pantomime of actual civil war. But the kinds of things that were going on in India, the kinds of things that were going on by the yellow vests, um, that is the kind of stuff that's going to have to happen in this country. And I don't see it right now, but I like the fact that your brother is saying something's going to have to happen. I agree with him, but but also the degree to which we have so much learning to do about how to organize ourselves and how to work together. Like we're like I would, if a person's just sitting on the couch watching Olympic athletes and basically saying, "Man, I could do faster than that," and you've only been on the couch, like you are going to have to do some push-ups. You are going to have to do some sprints in order to actually get out there and race. And I'm not saying people are taking it easy. I'm just saying the muscle of struggle and of collective struggle that needs to be developed. We've got a long way to go, and I suppose people can learn quickly. I do believe that, but uh, I don't I don't see anything around me that tells me that that is developing. And people saying something's got to happen. in some ways, there's a lot of wishful thinking in that. If someone's not saying, well, what am I going to do to start making something happen? Because I do think people are still waiting for somebody to do something. So
again, same, right? We can talk about this, we can watch all these videos, but it's just that. And then, what kind of alternative, what kind of challenges are actually, what kind of wrenches are thrown in through the machinery to actually make something happen. And again, but I also understand, right? Like the difficulty, the mountain of shit that is being piled on, on a lot of us, to be able to look up, and also, and by that I also mean the level of head washing,
yeah,
brainwashing that it's been done on us, and I guess that's part of having these conversations to see how we ourselves clear our own pile of shit. And but I get it. Like I know how hard it is to look up. If you're like fucking, like in my case, being a parent, in these circumstances.
yeah,
But again, I agree with that. Economists, or that there is no way out of this without pain, and it's just and again, we've had criticism of talking of revolution, right? And
yeah,
but I mean, this is the evidence, like, and revolution is fundamental change. And again, this is where I disagree with most of the people I listen to that talk about economics. They're more like libertarians. uh, that it's the system itself. It's not corrupt individuals. That, and so the system itself is what needs to be removed, not corrupt individuals, because you can cycle through people in the same system, and it's the same shit. It's just fucking madness.
yeah,
And so it's not. And again, like, if you spend some time just looking at the history of these fucking, again, more libertarian or patriotic people, like, really, like, when was the fucking US good? Like, and why was it, like, the US economy, right? Like, the boom that happened in the 50s, like 60s and 70s, that was, like you said, like a product of massive destruction that allowed the US to stay up and have some windfall on like a generation of people. But then that was fucking the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s happen, and look at all the fucking crises that have happened, and they're getting worse. And now, like, that relatively, I guess, uh, world peace, which I challenge, right? Is not that period, was those periods since the 50s to now, it's been full of war. It's just it hasn't been on a global scale, like, world war. But here we are, like, on the doorstep of that crisis reaching its pinnacle of violence, um, because of the dynamics that exist in this competitive system that seeks profit as a fundamental thing, rather than life and need, and and humanity. So yeah.
yeah. I mean, I would just say that again. Um, my people are looking at this election, whether it be Trump or Kamala Harris or Jill Stein or some third party candidate, as something that's meaningful for us, as indicating of the potential for change. But at the end of the day, if you want to think about the kind of change that the kinds of things you'd be looking for to indicate that real change is taking place would be the actual, like, remember January 6th from 2000, right? 2020. And everyone fucking loses their mind. Because first of all, that was like a little dog and pony show, largely run by the FBI. But anyone who is interested in really seeing change take place, some version of that's going to have to happen. Like a real version of that's going to have to happen. Like that won't, to me, that won't be like the start of it. That will be the final piece where you just get rid of all these parasites, and you get rid of their institutions, and you just say, "You be gone." You know, we're running our own show now. But the fact that as you go from left to right, many people find that abhorrent, the idea that people did what they did over there in January 6th, and they want to instead figure out, like, how do we return to, elections that are where the votes are really counted. That concerns me. I like, I think the fact they've done a real number on us to make us think that we should be afraid of insurrection. Even though, like, January 6th was not that. It really was largely an FBI operation used to crack down on people. But for those of us who want change, that's what we should be looking for. I mean, and we're not.
It shows that, like, most of the people that are criticizing what's happening, they're not on the quote unquote left. Most of the people are right wingers or libertarians who are questioning, the system to a point, because by and large, I think the people who are on the what they assume is the left, they're just committed to this project. There is very little questioning, and at least in my view. And so,
but people on the right are also critical of that January 6th thing, and are like thinking that Trump, and now getting excited about RFK Jr. is getting involved with it. That the illusions exist on both sides equally.
I mean, yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't have any. I don't know. That's the point, I guess. But again, it has to start somewhere, and there will be pain.
Yeah, and these problems are not going to go away. They're going to get worse because the situation is wrapped up in our economy, and the situation of economy, like capitalism, is a boom and bust creature. And the booms are going to become less dramatic, and the busts are going to get worse and worse. And they are going to take us to a particular place. And that's not just true in the United States. It's true in China. It's true in Russia. It's true across the globe. And this is a global affair we are wrapped up in. Anything else to say here at the end?
No, I mean, I think, people can go more in detail into different, more technical, and it's a lot to take in, a lot to learn.
I'll put in the thing that Jeff sent us, and can you resend me your 3 links so I can put those in the description? Well, I guess that's it then, Kenny. So that concludes this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog, what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to our podcast channel there and connect with us there using the contact form. I remind folks, if you like anything you've heard, please subscribe, rate, or review, and turn on your notifications to any of our 7 platforms: Spotify, iTunes, BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, or Telegram. And if you'd like to give us feedback about something you've heard, or suggest something for us to cover, or contact us through our blog. That's it for this week. Kenny, thanks a lot for doing this today. Alex, come back next week. Eduardo, and we'll be talking to you all with Michael Caine, hopefully. So see you next week.